Uh, Welcome to our time together. This week is what Christians traditionally call the Christmas of non-Jewish people. They have a fancy name for it, Epiphany, which just means when God turns on the light and people all over the world, not just Jewish people, people all over the world get the message that when God sent this particular child, he wasn't a normal human being. He was 100% God and 100% human, sent here with this unique job description to be the rescuer of all people of all time. So, Epiphany is when I think it's fair to say maybe half of Christianity around the world celebrates Christmas. They don't have it December 25th. Santa has to go out 2 times every year, the end of December, and then he has to go out again at the beginning of January, January 6th to be exact, and deliver all of his presents. And so for us, this time of year is when we look at the way that God really did turn on the light and really did bring the message to more and more people over time, and is doing the same thing today through Christians. So our first Bible section for today is from the New Testament book of Matthew. This is the account about the wise men. The wise men were wise because they were literate. They could read and write, which is something the vast majority of people could not do. And thirdly, they had books, including the Old Testament Bible, because there was no New Testament Bible at this time. And they're the ones who's found in the Old Testament Bible just doing general research. They found a spot that talked about God saying he would send a star when he sent his Messiah, and the star would rise above the nation of Israel. When these men who were learned in the astrology, when they learned that this star was out there, they saw a new star, they freaked out, and it took them a long time to travel from wherever they were in the east to the Holy Land, and still they did not know where to go yet. As you're going to hear, they have to go to the capital city and ask the experts, where does the Bible, the Old Testament, say that the Messiah is going to be born? And then the Bible scholars had to look in the book of Micah, and there they found it was Bethlehem. The guys were so excited, especially when they saw that the star reappeared and led them to the exact house. This is a big miracle. So they knew this was not a freak phenomenon. Stars don't label homes. So this was because God wanted to reach these guys. And this is the way that God reaches us too. The star he uses to reach us is his Bible message. Here's today's first Bible message. Jesus was born in the town of Bethlehem in Judea County when Herod was king. Much later means probably about 2 years later, because Herod sent out his soldiers right after the wise men came and told him to kill all the toddlers 2 years old or younger. So much later, this strange thing happened. Some scholars from the east came to Jerusalem. They asked, where is the child born as king over the Jews? We saw his star come up in the east and came to worship him. When King Herod heard about this, he got very upset, and so did everyone else in the city of Jerusalem. He called a meeting of all the head priests and the Jewish religion scholars and tried to find out from them where the Messiah was supposed to be born. They told him, the Bible says, in Bethlehem in Judea County. The prophet predicted this in our Bible. Bethlehem in Judah's land, another quoting Micah, you are not just an insignificant village in Judah. The king is going to come from your town. He'll be the shepherd of my people Israel. Then Herod had a secret meeting with the scholars from the east. He found out from them exactly when the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, saying, search carefully for this child. When you find him, come tell me so I can worship him too. With their information from the king, the scholars set off. Then the star appeared again. It led them until it stopped over the place where the child was. They could hardly contain themselves when they saw that star. The scholars from the east went into the house. They saw the child with his mother, Mary. So they fell to their knees with their foreheads on the ground and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In a dream, God warned those scholars from the east not to go back to Herod. So they left for their country by another road. And then we know that that same night, God warned Joseph to take this 2-year-old and his mother and head to Africa, where they lived until Herod died, which may have been as many as 3 or 4 years later. So Jesus would have grown up knowing languages from Africa, whatever language they were using there at the time, as well as his own people's language, the Aramaic and possibly the Greek that was so popular at this time. So this is all of the formative years of Jesus' life that the Bible gives us. It tells us about Mary and Joseph returning to the Holy Land after they got word that Herod had died. They were going to stay in Bethlehem again. Things had worked out for them there after Jesus had been born. But then they heard that in the big city a couple miles away, Herod's son was in charge. So they said, we're going back up north to Galilee County. And they went back to their hometown. And that's where Jesus spent the rest of his adolescent years. The next Bible section is from the Old Testament book of 1 Kings. And it records to us something really amazing. The first Jewish king was about 500 years after the Jewish people left Egypt, left Africa, and resettled in the Holy Land. 500 years. That was King Saul. He ruled for 40 years and then died. 40 years after that, for the next 40 years, David became king and probably, arguably, the most famous of the Jewish kings. He also ruled for 40 years, and then his son Solomon took over. He ruled for 40 years too, but this was a time of prosperity among God's people unlike anything that they could even imagine. During this time, I think it's fair to say that the Jewish people were kind of a world power around the Mediterranean. And all of the prosperity that they earned is what brought this ruler from way south of Egypt, even to travel all the way up, a female ruler, the Queen of Sheba. Queen of Sheba heard how famous Solomon was. He owed his reputation to the great things about Yahweh. In other words, when he was in touch with the only real God, and God had told Jewish kings in the Constitution he gave in the book of Deuteronomy to the people of Israel, he told them the king has to have his own copy of this Constitution that he carries around. He needs to be in touch with his real CEO. So Solomon owed his reputation to the great things about Yahweh. So the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem to put his reputation to the test and discuss difficult subjects. She brought along a large group of slaves, also camels carrying loads of spices, jewels, and very much gold. This was to bring as gifts to Solomon to solidify trade relations and any other kind of relations between their two countries, because obviously the people of Israel had something to offer other nationalities that could possibly bring them the same sort of prosperity the Jewish people enjoyed. When she and Solomon met, she talked with him about everything she had on her mind. Solomon had answers for all her questions. None was too hard for him to explain. The Queen of Sheba learned how wise Solomon was. She saw the palace he had built. She noticed the food on his table, the impressive way he organized his officials, and the uniforms they wore. She saw how his cupbearers protected him. She saw the extravagant whole animal offerings he sacrificed at Yahweh's temple. She was amazed. She told King Solomon, "It's all true. People say you have said and done incredible things. This news had reached all the way to my country. I could not believe it then. Now I have come and seen it with my own eyes. They hadn't even told me half. Your wisdom and wealth are a lot greater than what I'd heard. What a blessing for the men and women who work for you. What a blessing for your slaves. They get to be around you every day, and they get to listen to the wise things you say. Yahweh, your God, deserves the credit. He's the reason you're King of Israel. Your God's never-ending love for people who don't deserve it gave Israel you as king. Now you can rule fairly according to Yahweh's standards." Listen to the way this woman talks, because Solomon taught her. He taught her about God's love, which she says, she recites back what Solomon told her is the opposite of what the people of Israel deserved and everyone else deserved. And she learned about God's rescue plan, which Solomon displayed at the temple complex, where they saw the 2-story tall grill where they would place whole animal offerings that pictured what would happen to the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate representative for all human beings and their sins. He would face God's punishment, his fiery punishment, and people would be free to enjoy God's blessings. This is what she took back to her own nationality. I'll say one more thing before we go on. God had 2 different plans for the way to do his work before Jesus' arrival and after Jesus' arrival. Before Jesus' arrival, basically, it was kind of like, I guess you'd call it field of dreams Christianity, which is if you build it, people will come. And so Solomon built the temple God gave the blueprint for. God gave him incredible wisdom and insight into all kinds of things. He built an amazing palace. People came and then they learned the message. So the amazing things God did drew people in. And this is the field of dreams method that God used before Jesus came. After Jesus came and filled out the mission God gave him, then God told people, now we're going to do things different. Now it's not about what you build and then they'll come. Now you go out and spread the message. And so that's where we got go and make disciples of all nations. That was Jesus saying that. You go to them. They're not going to come to you. And so that's the way that God did his work back then and still does it today of turning the light on. Let's go to our last Bible section. It's from the New Testament book of Acts. The setting is central Turkey. It's a part of central Turkey they used to call Galatia. So the letter to the Galatians in our New Testament Bible was written to people in this area. And this is the ruins of the city of Antioch in central Turkey. The city was big enough for there to be a nucleus of Jewish people who lived there, who built their own Jewish community center, to which Paul, as a Jewish rabbi, would have an open invitation to come and be the featured speaker every Saturday and any other time Jewish people would meet. And so this is the way Paul did his mission work. Jewish people at their community center would also attract non-Jewish people in these large cities. Non-Jewish people had a bad taste in their mouth about the way their society was engineering life. There was murder, debauchery, wild living, right? Abortion, all kinds of stuff, tons of discrimination. Non-Jewish people would come to the Jewish community center because there they got a solid, stable standard of life that the God of the Bible laid out for them. What's right, what's wrong, what to do when you find out you're guilty of wrong. And so that's how the missionaries operated in this city of Antioch. They brought the news to the Jewish people at their community center. And this tells about the last time that they came. But Paul and Barnabas didn't back down. They said, we had to bring God's message to you Jews first. Remember, Jesus talked about this. He said that the Old Testament said that this news was a light to lighten Jewish people, and also a light for the Gentiles. In other words, the Bible's rule was always bring the news to Jewish people first after Jesus goes back to heaven. They know the Bible, and they'll be able to be natural leaders and explainers of the Bible to new people who don't have as much knowledge. We had to bring God's message to you Jews first. You people rejected it, though, and turned down God's offer of never-ending life. So now we're going to offer it to people of other nations. This is what God told us in the Bible, and here's a quote from the book of Isaiah. I have made you, Jewish people, a light for the other nations, so you Jews will tell how God rescued people worldwide. This made the non-Jews there glad that day. It was the greatest news they ever heard. Everyone God had picked for a never-ending life came to depend on Jesus. God's news kept spreading all over the area. Those mountains that you can see in the background there were a significant boundary, but there would be population centers between Antioch and the mountains, and other population centers to the other direction as well, all linked by a Roman engineered road, a highway, a big deal road that didn't wash out in bad weather or anything like that. And this is the way people could be sure they'd safely transport themselves and products they had from one place to another. If you go back here, let me show you. If you go back to this picture here, you can see a sign right here, bottom right side of some of these ruins. And that sign says, this is where people around 300 years after Paul built a famous St. Paul church on the site of where Jewish people had originally built their local community center, and where Paul first reached non-Jewish people, natives of the area. So this says that was around 46 AD. And then, close to 300 years after that is when they built this church as a memorial to the work that God allowed the missionary to do in this area in central Turkey. You may have noticed as we read through this section how stubborn those Jewish people were. God sent Paul to bring them the greatest news they could ever hear about what he had done in their place, how he had come to fill in for them and take their punishment at the end of his life. And Jewish people just thought, no, we've got those Old Testament rules for Jewish living you gave us. We're pretty sure if we do our best with those things, we don't need that stuff. So they rejected and stubbornly resisted this message. As the missionaries said here, you people rejected it and turned down God's offer of never-ending life. You can see how the work started. Over there in the bottom right side of the map, you see in Antioch. That was the second headquarters for Christianity after Jerusalem. Enemies cleared it out of Christians. So a lot of the Christians made a new headquarters up here in Antioch in Syria. That's where Paul was serving as a teaching minister of the Bible, along with 4 other guys. God picked 2 of those 5 pastors, Paul and Barnabas, to do foreign missionary work. God didn't even say where they should go. And so Barnabas goes, hey, I used to own property on the island of Cyprus, so I know that island pretty good. Paul said, well, might as well go there then and see if God blesses us. So as you can see from the map, that's where they went. And then when they got done with that island, they said, now what? So they said, let's take a boat up to the coast of Turkey. And we'll go up into the center of Turkey where the freeway is, Galatia, the state of Galatia, in the county of Pisidia, and we'll spread the news there along the freeway. We can make a big full circle. We'll come from one Antioch back to the other Antioch. And so that was their plan. And thankfully, there were Jewish populations in these big cities in Galatia, and they were able to pass the message along there. But it didn't get a lot of traction with Jewish people, mostly non-Jewish people. These cities were not hodunk towns in the middle of nowhere. These are some of the archaeologists' reconstructions of what Antioch in Galatia would have looked like. And they were all fancied up. They got the money and the technology to build these kind of palatial monuments. They had outdoor theater scenes where they could use the side of hills and make benches to watch beautiful theater productions of comedies and tragedies. They brought water from the mountains into the city to make Roman baths, and we can see the aqueducts that had been built. And so these were modern, up-to-date cities where people, you would think, non-Jewish people, especially non-Jewish people who don't even know the Bible, would have a lot of reasons for going, hey, we don't care. We got Roman baths, gymnasia, we got horse racing track, we got theaters. We don't need that stuff. We got enough entertainment already. But what happens is that God lets us get a mouthful of doing well. And we can see all it's going to do is lead us to a grave. And what happens after that? And so there were non-Jewish people coming to the Jewish Community Center to learn anything they could from the Old Testament Bible. You have to give these Jewish people in cities like Antioch and Galatia credit for being open-hearted enough to allow these non-Jews in. They did good that way. It's just they didn't like it when non-Jewish people became part of the family of believers in what Jesus stood for. They didn't like it when they heard Paul say things like, Jesus came to fulfill every obligation we were supposed to do. We don't have any, if you want to call it, religious obligation to God at all because of what Jesus did in our place. We can live our lives free of restrictions and rules because Jesus took care of all of it. Now we can serve him and love our neighbor. And so these non-Jewish people were pretty happy with that. The Jewish people, not so much. Jesus talked a little bit about this to Jewish people of his day when he worked in Jewish community centers where people, Jewish and non-Jewish, heard the Bible sections. And he talked about that Queen of Sheba we read about earlier today. He said, on Judgment Day, the Queen of Sheba is going to prosecute you people today of being guilty. In other words, you had the news, the life-saving news. Remember the Bible reading said, you turned down God's offer of never-ending life. Jesus goes on. She traveled all the way from Central Africa just to hear the wisdom that God gave Solomon. You people have someone far greater than Solomon here. That's about as close to open promotion of himself as Jesus got. You people have someone far greater than Solomon here. He has God 100% and human 100%. When we saw that picture of 2-year-old Jesus with the wise men earlier, it strikes us as kind of weird because we can't imagine 2-year-old God. But there's a 2-year-old boy, a human person, who's also contains 100% of God's very essence. He can't call on any of that godness in living compliant to all God's commands. And he didn't call on any of God's help to endure the punishment that God said you and I would have to suffer forever and ever. Someone greater than Solomon, because Solomon couldn't do any of that stuff. God could funnel into Solomon his wisdom about his plan, and Solomon could share that wisdom with other people. Jesus came to do that in addition to his other obligations. And he says, you have someone far greater than Solomon here, and you're disregarding that news? Look at Solomon's empire. What his father David left him with was a considerable kingdom that covered places like modern day Syria, Babylonia, or we would call it Iraq, parts of Turkey, parts of Africa. It was a huge area. And all of this stuff that God made Jewish people successful in was all to attract non-Jewish people. Even the way that David and Solomon set up the city with here's the temple complex, the Solomon Temple over here at the highest part of the population center, was all to draw people to see these sites and find out what it was all about. And then the Jewish people, with Solomon as their leader, would share the news about Messiah, who would be a Jewish guy, would be there to share himself with every single human being. That temple area was the place where every day I guess you'd call it the drama of Jesus' life with the animal substitutes that couldn't have any flaws in them, and the drama of Jesus' damnation, death played out every time there was an animal sacrifice and an animal incineration. It was all picturing what Jesus would do to get us into God's home, which the temple pictured with its greatness and gloriousness. People who don't belong there one bit, they would know God opened the doors to us by giving us Jesus. And now we can open the door to other people in the same way. And so that's what we're always remembering too. The whole Old Testament Bible is about Jesus, just like the New Testament is. Human beings can sense their own sin and unworthiness. We just explain that they're not being crazy when they have these sensations. And then we tell them about what Jesus did in the place of all mankind. Sometimes God seems distant. But is it because I've moved away from him? So we got to always remind ourselves that loving God, after we know his news, means loving his word and loving his people and loving spread that news out so that more people become part of his family of believers too. And it happens in the Lord's Supper that we'll get to enjoy today as well. Let's close with prayer. Father, thank you for laying it out for us once again. All of us, almost without exception, are non-Jewish people, but you loved us and sent Jesus to take our places as well. You had him take the place of people, no matter what their nationality, their family history, their language, their attitudes. You were indiscriminate in your love for us. Help us be more that way ourselves in this coming week. For Jesus' sake, amen. Now receive and believe the blessing of the Lord himself to you that comes courtesy of Jesus' life in our place. The Lord's blessing you all the time and protecting you constantly too. The Lord's making his face shine on you, and he's being gracious to you, the opposite of what we all deserve. The Lord's looking on you with his favor. He's paying attention, and he's giving you constantly his peace. And so that is that for this week.